I was born in the Chicago area. And Chicago, when I was there, was known as the most segregated city in America. But from what I gather, segregation, it's not just for humans anymore.
You know how to make a lead, man. So this is a really cool experiment out of Fordham, and this is in Manhattan, and they just caught a ton of rats, and they did DNA sequencing. What that means is they take these small nucleotide polymorphisms. They're called SNPs, SNPs. It doesn't really matter what they code for. You're sequencing little bits, small little bits that just happen to differ. The import of the differences is not important. It's just a way to say, how related are we? How many SNPs do we share? How many SNPs are different? Okay. So they do this, and they construct this map of how related the rats are to each other. And so they find several things that are really, really interesting. First of all, they all came over from Britain in 1750, 1780. There are rats from other places, but we inherited London's rats. And they have not been appreciably interbred with rats from other ports.
I'm going to say that I'm only slightly intimidated to realize that these rats have a more impressive pedigree than I do. But go ahead.
So the second thing that is interesting is that, for the most part, the rats breed within a pretty restricted area, usually about 200 meters, but up to 1,400 meters, which is 0.8 of a mile. And outside of that, they don't breed. The big finding that was very interesting is that if you look at just relatedness, the rats that are in Uptown, anything above Midtown, that's Harlem and all the way up, they're incredibly similar. They're a really tightly packed little group of rats, okay, big group of rats. And then you have next to them, but differing primarily in one component, are the Midtown rats. The Midtown rats are not that many in number, and they're different from the Uptown rats. Then you get to downtown, they're not a tight group, but they're different, and they're related to each other and not related to the Uptown rats. Usually what you do is you say that there's isolation by distance. If you're 100 miles away from me, I'm much less likely to interact with you than if you're a mile away from me or a foot away from me. The question is does that account for these differences? And the answer is no, because what you find is that it's not just distance, because some distances make very little difference and some distances make a very big difference. What really matters is landscape. And in Midtown, there is not the ecology to support the rat population as much as it is in the other two areas. There are probably a lot of reasons, but for one, there are some big areas such as convention centers and train stations and big places that are just not supportive of rats. And secondly, there's not as much heavily concentrated residential humans, consequently not as much food being tossed out. It reminds me how far we have come from our evolutionary roots, where we didn't have motorized vehicles, and traveling a long distance away from where you were born just simply wasn't possible. And so we've been mixing up for now thousands of years our genetic makeup.
Well, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, that when I was born, even though there were places in Chicago that were not geographically far removed, they were politically far removed.
Right.
It wasn't even so there are all kinds of reasons that populations can isolate themselves or be isolated against their wills from other populations.